Do you ever scroll past a woman on Instagram, standing in some gorgeous square in Italy, completely on her own, looking totally at ease, and think, okay, but how? How is she just doing that? Because I used to look at those women and think, well, she must be built differently. Like, there was just some confidence gene that I simply didn't get. And maybe you've thought that too. Maybe you've told yourself, I'll book the trip when I feel more confident. Or I'll go when the anxiety calms down a bit. Or once I stop overthinking every single detail, then I'll be ready. But here's the thing I really want you to consider today. Because I wish someone had asked me exactly this when I was overthinking my own first solo trip. What if that feeling was never coming? And what if you don't actually need it to? Welcome back to the Anxious Solo Female Traveller. I'm Katie, and this is the podcast for women who dream of solo travel, but anxiety or overthinking or 100 different what-ifs have kept that dream firmly on the maybe someday list. I've solo travelled to 24 countries now, with anxiety and social anxiety along for the ride every single time. And no, it never magically disappeared. I still overthink and I still spiral a bit, or sometimes a lot, before every trip. But I go anyway. And today I want to talk about something that I think gets completely misunderstood. Confidence. Because so many of us are waiting for it to show up first before we'll even let ourselves book a flight. But let's talk about why that's actually backwards. Okay, so here's a myth I want to bust straight away, because I believed it for years. The women you see who look completely fearless solo travelling on social media, they don't have some secret gene that makes them immune to fear. They've just built up more evidence than you have right now. That's genuinely it. That's the whole secret, if you can call it that. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. It just takes time. Before my first solo trip to Montreux in Switzerland, I remember thinking, well, I'm not exactly a confident extrovert, so solo travel just isn't really for people like me. I didn't want to backpack through Asia. I didn't want to stay in hostels or go to parties every night. And on top of that, I've also got social anxiety. So solo travel felt like something other people did. Braver people. More naturally confident people. Maybe you can relate. So if you've ever felt that way, if part of you has quietly decided that solo travel is for a certain kind of woman and you're just not her, I really want you to hear this. I decided that too. For ages, I'd scroll through Pinterest for hours, saving trip after trip. Dream boards full of places I wanted to go. But every single time I'd tell myself, well, maybe someday, once I feel confident enough to actually book. But spoiler, that someday confidence never showed up. I did not feel confident before my first solo trip. And honestly, most of the time I still don't. My anxiety is wonderfully, endlessly creative like that. But here's my top tip. You do not have to be a naturally confident extrovert to solo travel. You just need a bit more evidence than you have right now. And that comes with time, not with waiting. And honestly, I still don't think of myself as a confident person, whatever that word even really means. I still triple check my booking confirmations, obviously. I still get a tiny bit panicky if my phone battery drops below 50%, which is a completely rational fear in my opinion. I still get the pre-trip scaries, usually at 2 a.m. when it's highly inconvenient. But none of that has actually stopped me from going anywhere. It's just come along for the ride, every single time. So if confidence isn't some feeling you're sitting around waiting for, what actually is it? Well, it's proof. That's the whole definition as far as I'm concerned. Just proof that you've handled hard things before and come out the other side. And that proof doesn't need to be travel related at all. It can be absolutely anything. So if I was making my own list for this, it might look something like, I've sat through a whole show, actually many shows, at the theatre completely alone. In London, I might add, arguably one of the most overwhelming, busy cities in the world. I got through that first, genuinely terrifying week at a new job. I've had really difficult conversations in friendships and somehow found my way through them. See how small some of those things sound? We wouldn't even necessarily think of them as confidence, but they are. Every single one of them is evidence. And I think fear can get so loud around solo travel specifically that we forget to give ourselves any credit at all for what we've already survived, travel related or not. So here's a little exercise that you can do, because it made such a difference to me. Grab your notes app or a notebook, whatever's nearest, and just start writing down every hard thing you've already handled in your life. It doesn't matter how small it feels. It really doesn't need to be travel related in the slightest. Just start the list. And I promise you, it will grow faster than you ever expect. Because here's the thing about our brains. They are so good, almost annoyingly good, at remembering everything that's gone wrong or everything that could still go wrong, but go strangely foggy on all the things we've already handled just fine. So this exercise basically forces your brain to catch up with the evidence it's been not so subtly ignoring. And once you've made the list, keep it somewhere you'll actually see it. Add to it whenever something new comes to mind, because honestly, this should be a living, evolving document. I know mine still is. Because that list right there, that's your evidence. And evidence, not some magical breakthrough moment that comes maybe someday, is what true confidence is actually built from. Okay, so now you've got some evidence. The next piece is learning to take your first trip in tiny steps, not one giant leap. Because your first solo trip isn't one big decision. It's a series of small ones. And looking at the whole thing at once is basically a guaranteed way to overwhelm yourself before you've even booked anything. I know this one from experience, and I'm going to be completely honest with you about how badly I got it wrong the first time. About a year into solo travelling, I decided I wanted to do a month-long Interrail trip to France, Monaco, Italy, and Germany. So I sat down with my planner, all excited, ready to map it out. And I got about as far as opening the page, and then I cried. Like, genuinely, properly cried. Because it felt so overwhelming, to the extent that I actually abandoned the whole trip for weeks. But looking back now, I can see exactly what happened. I took the overwhelm personally. I thought, well, if you can't even handle planning this, how on earth are you going to handle the actual trip? And that, right there, is exactly what a lack of confidence does to us. It takes something that's just naturally a lot and turns it into a verdict on who we are. But anyway, eventually I did come back to it, and I decided to take it one teeny tiny step at a time. Genuinely the smallest steps I could break it down into. And it didn't matter how long it took, as long as I didn't overwhelm my anxious brain, because the second I did, it would start yelling every scary what if it could think. And it did take a while, if I'm honest, months, actually. But I got there. And I will always be so glad that I didn't let my lack of confidence in the planning stop me from actually going. Because I got to wander through the beautiful whitewashed streets of Puglia. I saw the most stunning autumn colours in Heidelberg. I fully leaned into being a tourist in Rome, gelato and all. And I made memories from that trip that I will genuinely have for life. So if you take one single thing from this episode, let it be this. Don't try to plan the whole trip at once. Just choose one thing to focus on today. That's genuinely all the confidence you need right now in this moment. Now, your first solo trip doesn't need to be the moment your confidence gets tested for the first time either. There are loads of small, practical things you can try before you even book a single flight. So here's a few ideas. Take yourself on a solo day trip, somewhere close to home. Eat a meal alone at a local cafe or a restaurant if you're feeling that. Go to the cinema by yourself. Or even just spend one night in a hotel in your own city or hometown. When I first started doing this for myself, I used to take myself to National Trust Gardens near where I lived. And then eventually I built up to taking myself to London for theatre matinees. I got so into it, I think I went to maybe about 6 shows in one summer, just because I was so determined to keep building that evidence. My favourite show is Waitress, by the way, highly recommend. But anyway, keep these things doable, not aspirational. This isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's just about quietly collecting proof for yourself that you can do this. And I know that a solo trip to the cinema probably sounds almost silly compared to booking a flight abroad. But that's kind of the point. It's not supposed to feel like a big deal. It's supposed to feel almost boring. Because boring means your brain isn't panicking. Or at least not as much. And a brain that isn't panicking is a brain that's quietly filing away evidence in the background, whether you notice it happening or not. And here's something else worth saying. Your actual first solo trip doesn't have to be the biggest, boldest thing you'll ever do in your life. And honestly, I'd argue that it shouldn't be. It should be deliberately small. It doesn't need to tick 5 things from your bucket list to somehow count. Because there's this idea floating around that every trip has to be your dream trip, your big adventure, or it's somehow just not worth doing. But that's not true. Not even a little bit. Now, here's something I wish someone had told me a long time ago, because it would have saved me a lot of unnecessary guilt. Confidence isn't a straight line. And I wish I could sit here and tell you that once you've built some, it just stays, steady forever. But that's not how it works, unfortunately. It's completely normal for the doubts to creep back in, even after you've booked, and even mid-trip. Honestly, I still spiral now before every single trip I take, even now, 5+ years in, and 24 countries in. And the same dramatic what-ifs still show up, just as loud as they were before that very first trip. But here's the difference now. I know that I can travel with my anxiety, and I'm not waiting for it to disappear before I'm allowed to go. So if your confidence dips again, and it will, please hear me on this. That doesn't undo any of the progress you've already made. It just means that you're doing something outside your comfort zone. And that is exactly the moment your brain is supposed to react. That's its whole job. So let it wobble, and then take your tiny next step anyway. If you'd told 18-year-old me, standing at the gate, waiting for that flight to Switzerland, wanting more than anything to just turn around and go home, that she'd go on to solo travel to 24 countries, I would not have believed you. Not even for a second. I was terrified. I had zero confidence, and I had anxiety and social anxiety. But I got on that plane anyway, and that trip became my very first little piece of travel evidence. And every trip after that added a little bit more. Not because the anxiety ever disappeared, although, believe me, I wish, but because I kept collecting proof, one tiny step at a time. And on my most recent solo trip, I stood under the Northern Lights in Norway, halfway through a 3-week solo rail trip and coastal voyage that had genuinely been my dream since I was 16 years old. And I was still anxious. My brain still handed me a fresh list of creative new what-ifs before I left, the same as always. But I was there anyway, living out that dream, because of every single tiny step that came before it. And that's really the whole point of this episode. It was never about becoming fearless. I, for one, don't think that's ever going to happen to me. And it doesn't need to happen to you either. It's just about collecting small pieces of proof, one trip at a time, that you can do this with your anxiety, instead of waiting for the day it disappears. So before we wrap up, here's your one small step for the week. I want you to think about every hard thing you've already done in your life. And again, it doesn't matter if it's travel related. It really doesn't need to be. Open your notes app, grab a notebook, whatever works, and just start the list. Because I promise you, once you actually see it written down in front of you, you'll realise you have far more evidence than you think. And just maybe, the woman who's convinced she isn't brave enough to travel solo is actually a lot braver than she's given herself credit for. So if you've been waiting to become a completely different person before you book, or waiting for the anxiety to disappear first, and then you'll be ready, I really hope this episode gave you permission to stop waiting for that. You don't have to become fearless. You don't need to wake up one day suddenly feeling brave enough, because spoiler, that morning never comes. Instead, you get to bring your anxiety along with you, overthink, and still book the flight anyway. Now, if you're sitting here thinking, okay, I actually want to do this, but I have no idea where to even start, that's exactly why I built my free email course, 7 days to your first solo trip, even if you're anxious. It's completely free, and it walks you through one small, doable step each day, so you're never trying to figure out the whole trip at once. just like we talked about today. It's genuinely the step-by-step guide I wish someone had handed me before that first trip to Switzerland, back when I was still convinced that someday confidence was ever going to show up on its own. I'll pop the link in the show notes or the description if you're watching on YouTube. And in the next episode, we're getting straight into the exact system I used to plan my first solo trip with anxiety. If that sounds like something you need, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next episode.